right. Good evening, everyone. And I'm excited to be here with you this evening. I'll be taking the lead on this conversation brought to you by Law Accent. And today, guess what? We are taking it, you know, jumping into something that is quite a conversation that we need to begin to have, especially for businesses, especially for entrepreneurs. And I'm going to give a context after which I'll get into the topic itself and why we are having that topic. So, imagine that many businesses are having a need to have their data, keep data, and data in this context could include, let's say, the business information, which might include their intellectual property information, even data around how they get results, and many other things. And these are crucial things. For instance, somebody says, Itayo, I had this information, which is our business plan. And then our business plan was then taken by another entity, stolen. Let's use that word, by another entity, and now it's being used. Or somebody says, well, so I have this information that has the list of our clients, and then this information has now been stolen. And bear with me, I'm being conscious of the use of the word stolen, just using that expression that could have come from somebody that is grieving from the fact that certain information about the company was exposed to the wrong people. So imagine that kind of situation, and then you begin to ask the question, so what do I do in this case? I'm aware that there is a law that guards against the use of information. Can I simply, take up an action? And just to set things right, the backdrop to this conversation came from the very fact that we have entities, we have websites that publish the data of companies. And the data in this sense would mean both the name of the company, the address, when the company was registered, the directors, the shareholders, and then let's say that your company was also published, and all of this information. And then you start thinking, what can you leverage on the data protection law uh, where you are? And in this context, we are talking about the Nigeria Data Protection Act 2023. So you then begin to wonder, can you leverage this kind of law to insist that those information about the company belong to the company, and the company should be given right to privacy, which is one of those foundational principles around data practices. So this conversation is against that backdrop because somebody asked that question anyway, and then we thought there is a need to have that conversation, which is the question: do corporates really have a right to their data? Do corporates really have a right to their data? Which is a very interesting question, against the backdrop that I gave. Now, let's start by looking at the law. In this context, we are going to be looking at the law in Nigeria, and even though we would also be taking some, taking cue from the GDPR, which is operative in the EU, and we see what we can learn from the context of those laws. Now, the example I've given, remember the question is, can the company now take steps against the website or the listing web to then challenge the display of their information under the Data Protection Act? I would like to take a reading from the Data Protection Act, which is operative in Nigeria, and then let's see what it conceives to be a data in the context of what it protects. Now, personal data is defined, and I want to read out exactly what it says. Any information relating to an individual who can be identified or is identifiable directly or indirectly by reference to an identifier, which could include name, identity number, location, and all of that. So now, this is the interesting thing that we have in our law. Even though for me, I think that that law may have really been more definitive in qualifying the individual used as a natural person. And this is because an individual could be a corporate entity or an artificial person. So if care is not taken, that context is taken outside of it. But then if we then decide to pick the example of what the law is under the GDPR, where personal data is considered to be any information that has to do with whether, I mean, a natural person, and I like that word, natural person, which could be identifiable or an identified natural person. I think this really gives context that that law, is applicable only to natural persons. But in the context of what we have, which I just read out from our own local law, which is the Nigerian Data Protection Act 2023, you find that there seems to be a difference, and there seems to be what I would call a loophole that can still be, be used without abused at some point. But the good thing is that by its nature, you cannot say that companies have a right to privacy. One of those things that I tell people when it comes to data protection, if you look at the antecedent, if you look at the historical perspective to what we know today, the foundation for data protection is the fact that people should be given a level of rights of privacy. And then you ask the question, so can corporates claim a right to privacy? Now, I'll leave that question for you, and I want us to have this in the comment box, depending on the perspective that you are coming from. But I assume that you are listening to this because you also want to know what are the best practices I can leverage on for my company, and especially to make sure that information is not pushed out or is not disclosed to members of the public without some consent from the company, as it were. Now, based on the interpretation that we've given, it means that there has to be some other things you need to think of doing, or some other ways of making sure that your data is protected, because as a corporate, the policy will then be it is better you protect your data than you trying to insist or to challenge that there is a data leakage. And what are those things you can do? One of those things you can do is to make sure, by way of an agreement, you protect your data. How does this work? So let's say, for instance, you have what is called confidentiality agreement, you have what is called non-disclosure agreement. These are agreements that will make sure that whatever information you are disclosing, not just about your company, but about the substance of whatever is being shared. It could be even about a project that the company is involved in. This would mean that it cannot be shared to members of the public or anyone at that, according to what is stated in the agreement. Now, this is one of those tools that will be very essential if you are thinking of how do you make sure that your data is protected sufficiently. And going away from there, I think one other thing you can do is to make sure you have a robust policy around your data use, and even don't be surprised. Such policy should extend to making sure that you avoid cyber attacks. So your cyber security policy, password policy, and many other things, you need to make sure you have all of these things in place. I think the position of the corporate is the fact that it is better avoided than trying to find solution, because in the real sense you are not protected under the data protection laws or data protection act or the GDPR. You need to protect yourself in some other ways, and these are some of those ways that we are sharing in this conversation. And let me leave you with something before I go. Does it mean that this point I've said is cast in stone? I wouldn't say so. In essence, if you find that your company is housing information belonging to members of the company, that is, natural persons within the company, and then the natural person's data has now been extracted illicitly without following legal procedure, then that potentially gives you the ground to challenge that infringement. Oh, I think I've said too many things in a very huge way. Now, simply put, what I'm saying is this: if you can show that information that is in question are information belonging to natural persons, that's individuals, and that by reason of the fact that a third party now has access to those information, that third party is now in breach of the rights of those natural persons. Now, this is a creative way of handling that situation. What do I mean in essence? Taking again the example that I made mention of at the start of this conversation. Mr. Jack has found that his company name, company profile, everything has been leaked on a platform. Now, Jack Investment Limited cannot challenge those things. But potentially, the question we should be thinking of is this: can the names listed, can they challenge that by listing their names, there's a violation of their individual rights? That is, the corporates may not, by virtue of what we've said so far, be able to challenge. But can the natural people within the entity, can they challenge that publication? I leave that to you, and I would want us to see the conversation going on in the comment box. And hopefully, we can all brainstorm on this as we keep building our businesses and being data compliant. Thank you for joining this conversation. My name is Eitayo Ogunwemi, and do have for yourself a wonderful, wonderful evening.